The case we're about to delve into occurred almost 100 years ago in 1936, but while it happened a long time ago, this case remains unforgettable due to its unsettling intimacy and almost surreal nature. This was a crime driven by obsession and desire, culminating in an act so shocking it still disturbs many to this day. It was the evening of May 19, 1936. A woman checks into a small hotel in Shinagawa, Japan. Using a false name, she was polite and unassuming, drawing little attention as she settled into her room. Earlier that day, she had gone shopping, watched a film, and then upon returning to her room, treated herself to a massage and 3 bottles of beer. There was nothing outwardly remarkable about her, just another guest in a bustling city. But outside the walls of that quiet in the city was gripped by unease. Tokyo was in a state of unrest. A nationwide manhunt was in full force. Newspapers ran bold, frantic headlines, while radio broadcasts delivered constant updates. The victim was a well-known businessman named Kichizo Ishida. He had been found dead in a lodging in just days earlier. But it wasn't his death that shocked the nation. Rather, it was the gruesome condition of his body. At the crime scene, investigators found something that provided a crucial clue. A message scrawled with blood on the bed sheets that read, "We Sada and Kichi are alone." The name Sada, spelled Sadia, was also carved into Ishida's left arm. This was one of the key indications that Ishida's death was no accident. It was intentional and most likely deeply personal. His body bore clear signs of strangulation evident from the bruising around his neck. But authorities soon realized that Ishida's genitals had been severed and were nowhere to be found. Witnesses from the inn reported that Ishida had been staying with a woman in the days leading up to his death. Further inquiries led them to identify this woman as Sada Abe. Soon reports of supposed sightings of Sada flooded in from all over Tokyo, and the police were overwhelmed. Then at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, on May 20th, 1936, detectives knocked on the door of the small inn in Shinagawa. When the woman answered, she calmly identified herself as Sada Abe. Her small frame and gentle demeanor didn't match the image of a brutal killer, and the officers couldn't help but hesitate. Was this the woman they had been relentlessly pursuing, the one responsible for a crime so grotesque it had sent the entire nation into a panic? Instead of the ruthless murderer they had envisioned, she appeared calm and composed, not the monster the headlines had described. Sensing that the police weren't convinced, Sada Abe reached into the folds of her kimono and carefully retrieved something. As she slowly unwrapped it, the officers' expressions shifted from confusion to horror. In 1936, Japan was a nation that was straddling the line between tradition and modernity. The old ways still linger, but change is undeniable. Cities are growing, industries are booming, and Western influences creep into daily life. Yet in the shadows of progress, remnants of the past remain untouched, especially in Tokyo's pleasure districts. For centuries, these districts had been the heart of entertainment and vice. Prostitution may be the world's oldest profession, but in Japan's red light quarters, a strict hierarchy determined a woman's fate. At the top were the highest-ranking courtesans admired for their beauty, intelligence, and talent. Below them were the entertainers, who captivated wealthy patrons with music, dance, and conversation. But not every woman in this world found success. Those who failed to attract wealthy clients were forced into lower-class brothel, where they had little control over their fate. Here the line between entertainer and prostitute blurred, leaving many with no real choices. This was the world that Sada Abe knew. Once a geisha and later a waitress, she had spent years moving through Tokyo's pleasure districts, a place where desire had a price and love was often transactional. Sada Abe was born on May 28, 1905, in the Kanda district of Tokyo. She was the youngest surviving child in a family known for making tatami mats, the traditional straw flooring used in Japanese homes. Her family wasn't part of the wealthy elite, but they lived comfortably. They were well respected in their community, financially stable, and had a good reputation. Sada's father, Shigeyoshi, was an honest businessman, though some described him self-centered and indulgent. Her mother Katsu doted on Sada, allowing her freedoms that her older siblings never had. Unlike her siblings who worked in the family's tatami business, Sada was encouraged to explore music and the arts. She learned to play the shamisen, a traditional Japanese instrument, and took singing lessons. Although her childhood appeared stable on the surface, signs of trouble were already beginning to show. As Sada entered adolescence, she began to show signs of rebellion. She skipped school, spent time with boys, and wore fashionable makeup, something that was considered inappropriate for a young girl of her class at the time. Her parents, worried about her behavior, tried to rein her in. But during this period, something happened that would change her life forever. At just 14 years old, Sada was sexually assaulted by an acquaintance, an older student from Keio University. In the aftermath, her parents struggled with how to respond. Unsure of how to handle the situation, they made a decision that would set her on a very different path. They sent Sada to train as a geisha. Contrary to common misconceptions, geishas in Japan are not prostitutes. They are highly skilled entertainers deeply rooted in Japanese culture and tradition. They dedicate years to mastering classical music, dance, and the art of refined conversation, serving as cultural ambassadors who entertain guests through performance rather than intimacy. The most esteemed move in elite circles, performing for the wealthy or government officials. However, not all attain such prestige. Those who enter the profession later in life or fail to secure padrons often struggle. For these women, many end up in lower-tier establishments where the distinction between entertainment and prostitution becomes more blurred. Life as a geisha was nothing like Sada had imagined. She had entered this world too late. Real geisha began training as children, spending years mastering dance etiquette and music. Sada, already a teenager, was considered an outsider among them. She was treated as lesser, and instead of performing in elegant tea houses for high-ranking clientele, she was placed in the lowest tier of geisha work, providing companionship to men in ways that were far beyond conversation. Nevertheless, it was here that Sada truly learned the power of seduction, but it came at a cost. She contracted syphilis, a common but potentially fatal disease if left untreated. In 1925, being diagnosed with syphilis would only mean a lifetime of painful treatments and invasive medical examinations. There was no cure, only crude therapies that were often as harmful as the disease itself. Geisha were largely exempt from these routine health checks, as they were considered entertainers rather than sex workers. Prostitutes, on the other hand, were closely monitored by the government, forced to undergo frequent and often degrading medical inspections. For Sada, the distinction between the two professions had always been thin, but now it was meaningless. If society was going to treat her like a prostitute, forcing her into the same humiliating procedures and marking her as unclean, then why continue the pretense of being a geisha at all? At least prostitutes had control over their own earnings, worked on their own terms, and could abandon the rigid hierarchy of the geisha world, a world that would never accept them anyway. To Sada Abe, she likely thought that if she was going to be treated this way, she would do it on her own terms. For the next several years, Sada Abe moved between licensed brothel and the underworld of illegal prostitution. But that world was brutal, clients were often violent. Money was never guaranteed, and women were considered disposable, easily replaced, easily forgotten. But Sada refused to be just another woman lost in the system. She wanted more. More control, more security, more power over her own life. She was tired of being at the mercy of others, tired of scraping by while men used her and discarded her. She wanted more, and she was ready to take it. By 1936, years of drifting through the pleasure districts had left her exhausted. She had seen the uglier sides of desire, lived under the control of others, and struggled to find any real sense of security. She wanted stability, a fresh start, perhaps even a chance at a normal life. Eventually, she took a job as a waitress at Yoshida, a modest but well-regarded restaurant in Tokyo. It was a change from her past, a step away from the world of brothel and geisha houses. But it was there that she met the man who would alter the course of her life forever, Kichizo Ishida. Ishida was not an extraordinary man in any traditional sense. He wasn't powerful or famous. He was simply a businessman, the owner of the restaurant Yoshida, and a serial womanizer. Though he was married, he had a reputation for seducing his female employees, using his wealth and charm to draw them into his orbit. For most, he was just another unfaithful husband seeking distractions outside his home, but for Sada, Ishida was different. Unlike the men who had treated her as disposable, he showered her with attention. He was playful, indulgent, and unrestrained in his desires. With him, she felt wanted not as a product to be bought, but as a woman to be adored. He fed something inside her that had long been starved. Passion without restraint, affection without conditions. Within no time at all, their affair had escalated, turning into something neither of them seemed willing to control. They would disappear for days at a time, shutting themselves away in rented tea house rooms, drinking, laughing, and making love without limits. On one occasion, sources state that they remained in a hotel bed for 4 days, straight, lost in their own world. Sometimes they would make love while accompanied by the soft melodies of a geisha singing in the next room. Even as maids entered to serve them sake, they carried on as if no one were there. In those moments, nothing else mattered. No responsibilities, no consequences, just the thrill of desire and indulgence. It was all-consuming, almost hypnotic. But soon it would end in the most horrific way. One night, in the midst of their passion, Sada slipped a sash around Ishida's neck and tightened her grip. To her surprise, he didn't resist. He welcomed it. Encouraged by his reaction, they continued. Over time, Sada became bolder, testing new ways to heighten their pleasure. While Ishida's tolerance for risk grew, what started as a thrill was now a routine and unspoken game of trust and control that only deepened their obsession with each other. But for Sada, it wasn't enough. To her, the thought of Ishida returning to his wife or lying in another woman's arms was unbearable. The idea that she was just another passing indulgence tormented her. Jealousy crept into every moment, eating away at her until it became something darker, something dangerous. A single thought began to take shape in her mind. If she couldn't have him forever, then nobody would. After 2 weeks of indulgence, their affair finally came to an end. Ishida returned to his life, his restaurant, his wife, his responsibilities. But for Sada, there was no returning to normal. The separation left her restless, on edge. She tried to silence the thoughts with alcohol, drinking excessively to dull the ache, but it wasn't enough. She could not let him go. On May 9th, Sada attended a play in which a geisha, driven mad by jealousy, lashed out at her lover with a knife. The scene unfolded with raw intensity, the woman's fury, the man's betrayal, the final act of desperate possession. Sada sat motionless, her breath shallow, her fingers tightening in her lap. To her, this wasn't just a performance. It was a reflection of the thoughts that had been circling in her mind for days. The idea had already taken root, but now it burned with clarity. The next time she saw Ishida, she wouldn't come empty-handed. 2 days later, on May 11th, Sada prepared to meet Ishida once again. Another night of passion awaiting them, but this time she had a plan. Before meeting him, she stopped at a pawn shop, gathering pieces of her clothing to sell. The delicate silks and fine fabrics that once clung to her skin were now nothing more than currency traded for a handful of bills. With the money in hand, she walked to another store and carefully selected a kitchen knife. She slipped it into her bag, her fingers grazing the cold steel, feeling its weight against her palm. As she set off toward Ishida, her heartbeat quickened, not with doubt, not with fear, but with certainty. That night, as they lay together once again, Sada finally pulled the knife from her bag. The scene from the play she had watched days earlier replayed in her mind. The geisha, consumed by jealousy, threatening her lover with a blade. Now Sada was reenacting it. Pressing the cold blade against Ishida's chest, she accused him of dressing up for another woman. Her voice was sharp and trembling with rage. Ishida flinched, startled for a moment, but to Sada's surprise, a slow smile began to spread across his face. Amused by her jealousy, he leaned into the danger, teasing her, testing her resolve. Before long, the tension between them morphed into something else, reigniting their passion, wild, reckless, and unrestrained. At one point, Sada slid the knife down his body, pressing the blade against the base of his genitals. Leaning in close, she whispered that she would make sure he never touched another woman again. Ishida just laughed. For the next 2 nights, they pushed each other further, exploring the edge between pleasure and pain. At Sada's command, Ishida would wrap his hands around her throat, squeezing until she teetered on the brink of unconsciousness. She would also do the same to him, and both of them would be lost in the dangerous thrill of control and surrender. But on the evening of May 16th, as their bodies moved together, Sada reached for her scarf and slipped it around Ishida's neck, this time a little tighter than usual. She watched as he writhed beneath her, his body tensing under the strain. Again and again they repeated the act, each time holding on a little longer. Each time pushing the limits a little further until the boundary between pleasure and suffocation blurred beyond recognition. But then something changed. The last time Sada tightened the rope, she might have put in too much strength, and Ishida's face began to grow distorted, his features twisting with discomfort. The pleasure that had once fueled their game was gone, replaced by something unsettling, something wrong. Ishida groaned, his body struggling to recover, muscles locked in tension that refused to fade. Desperate for relief, he reached for a bottle of Calmodin and swallowed 30 tablets, hoping that the powerful sedative would dull his pain. As the sedative dragged him into drowsiness, Ishida turned to Sada, his voice slow and uncertain. He asked if she was going to do it, if she was going to wrap the cord around his neck again while he slept. This was not a plea for mercy nor a request, just a question lingering between them. And then, as if resigning himself to whatever came next, he told her that if she did, she could not stop halfway. That, he said, would be far worse than dying. Sada sat still, watching him drift between wakefulness and sleep. Was this what he truly wanted, or was he simply surrendering to whatever she decided to do next? She let the question hang in the air as Ishida drifted into sleep. And at 2 a.m. on May 18th, as he lay motionless beside her, Sada reached for her scarf, wrapped it twice around his throat, and pulled tight. This was the very last breath that Ishida would take. For several hours, Sada lay beside Ishida's lifeless body, holding him close, as if nothing had changed. The warmth had already begun to fade from his skin, but she didn't recoil. Instead, she embraced him, pressing her face against his chest, inhaling his lingering scent. But lying with him wasn't enough. She needed something more, something permanent. Reaching for the kitchen knife, Sada pressed the blade to his body and with careful precision severed his penis and testicles. Blood pooled beneath him, soaking into the sheets. But she remained steady, wrapping the detached flesh in a magazine cover before tucking it away. This was her keepsake, something to carry with her, something that would make him hers forever. When morning came, she dressed herself in Ishida's underwear and left the room. But before stepping out of the inn, she turned to the staff and calmly told them not to disturb him. The next day, Sada locked herself away in a quiet room, dedicating hours to writing farewell letters. One was meant for Omiya, the man she had once loved. Another was addressed to a close friend. And the final letter, perhaps the most painful, was written to Ishida himself. With each carefully chosen word, she tried to put into writing what could never truly be explained. She had already made her decision. A week from now, she would end her own life. But before that, there was something she couldn't let go of. Beside her, wrapped carefully in paper, lay the last physical piece of Ishida, the part of him she had taken as her own. Slowly, Sada unwrapped it, her fingers trembling. But it wasn't fear that made her hands shake, it was longing. What Sada did next defied all reason. She ran her fingers over the lifeless flesh and then grabbed it with her hands. Lifting it to her lips, she pressed it gently against her mouth, closing her eyes, trying to summon the illusion that he was still with her. But it didn't stop there. At one point, she even removed all her clothes and tried to insert Ishida's severed genitals into herself, as if that could somehow revive what had been lost, as if she could reclaim the intimacy that death had taken from her. But no matter how many times she tried, it was futile. Ishida was gone, and nothing could ever bring him back. Frustrated yet undeterred, she made one final plan. She would flee to Osaka, carrying Ishida's remains with her. And when the time came, she would climb to the cliffs of Mount Akoma and throw herself into the abyss with his flesh clutched tightly in her hands. However, before she could do that, there was a knock on her door. At 4:00 p.m., the local police arrived at the following reports of a woman traveling under a false name. Sada answered without hesitation. There was no fear, no attempt to run. Instead, she met their gaze with an air of quiet amusement. She told them there was no need for formality. The officers hesitated, unconvinced. The woman who was standing before them was soft-spoken, composed, and did not match the image of the fugitive they had been hunting. But then Sada reached into her pocket, retrieved something, and slowly unwrapped it before their eyes. The detectives recoiled in horror because in her hands were the severed remains of Kichizo Ishida. Sada Abe was arrested and subjected to 8 rounds of interrogation, each session peeling back the layers of her unsettling devotion. When asked why she had severed Ishida's genitals, her response was chillingly simple. She couldn't take his entire body with her, so she took the one part that held the most vivid memories. But it was her explanation for the murder itself that truly fascinated the nation. Records state that as she spoke, her eyes sparkled with an eerie excitement. She confessed that she hadn't killed Ishida out of jealousy, but out of love. As long as he was alive, he could still be with other women, but in death, he would belong to her alone. Sada Abe's trial began on November 25, 1936, drawing massive public interest. By dawn, crowds had already gathered outside the courthouse, eager to witness the proceedings. Her crime captivated Japan not just because of its brutality, but because of the raw, obsessive passion behind it. Before receiving her sentence, Sada made a final statement insisting that she was not the sexual deviant the public had made her out to be. She spoke of Ishida as unlike any man she had ever known, claiming that while she had been with others out of affection rather than money, no one had ever made her feel the way he did. But no matter how deep her love had been, murder was still murder. On December 21, 1936, she was convicted of murder and mutilation of a corpse. The prosecution had pushed for a 10-year sentence, but interestingly, Sada herself claimed she deserved the death penalty. In the end, she was sentenced to just 6 years in prison and was sent to Tochigi Women's Penitentiary, where she was registered as prisoner number 11. For years later, in 1940, her sentence was commuted as part of Japan's 2600th anniversary celebrations of its mythical founding. Then on May 17, 1941, exactly 5 years after the murder, Sada Abe walked free. After her release, Sada Abe faded from public life, but her story never did. The details of her crime took on a life of their own, twisting into myth and speculation. Among the most infamous rumors was the reason behind Sada's obsession. Many believed that Ishida's manhood was likely of an extraordinary size, the key to her uncontrollable desire. However, the officer who interrogated Sada dismissed the rumor entirely. Ishida, he claimed, was physically unremarkable. He had even asked Sada about it directly, but she only laughed, brushing off the idea. Size she insisted had nothing to do with her obsession. It was his skill, his passion, and the way he made her feel that had consumed her completely. After Sada was sent to prison, Ishida's severed remains were sent to Tokyo University Medical School's Pathology Museum, preserved and labeled as a curiosity. Years later, after World War II, they were put on public display, a grim relic of one of Japan's most infamous crimes. But after some time, the display vanished without any explanation. As for Sada Abe, the last known record of her was her death in 1971 at the age of 66.